Welcome to CUFIS Network.
Hi, welcome to another episode of CUFIS Network. I'm Danial Surti, the Marketing Co-Director for CUFIS, and today I have the pleasure of hosting Dan Mikulskis. Dan graduated from the University of Cambridge with a degree in mathematics, joining in the investment consultancy industry at Mercer, and he qualified as an actuary there. He then went on to join the quant world at Macquarie and Deutsche Bank, amongst others, before finally becoming a partner at LC&P. Dan, it's a pleasure to have you on. Welcome.
Hi, thank you so much. Really great to be here.
So why don't we just start at the beginning? You joined university in 2000, 2001, something like that, and
yeah, it was in 1999 actually. I'm matriculated. Yeah.
So you joined university then. Did you know you wanted to become an investment consultant there, or was it something that happened, figured out?
Yeah, you know what? I did part 3 maths actually at Cambridge, and there was a course there on actuarial science or something like that. And I quite like that, and I guess that was one of the first times that I kind of thought to myself, this is something that I enjoy, and I think I might be reasonably good at, and something that might be worth sort of looking into as a career. So from then on, really, I kind of had in my mind the idea of applying to actuarial firms, and then obviously you're faced with this choice between investment consulting, traditional actuarial routes, and sort of other areas, and that was a little bit more sort of random, but yeah, I got involved in investment consulting, and I was really happy with that choice, really.
So as you mentioned, the differences between actuarial sciences and investment consultancy. What does an investment consultant actually do, and how does that differ from these other fields that are quite close to it?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly didn't appreciate this as much as I would have liked to. Looking back when I was applying for jobs, I guess, and as an investment consultant, you're working with big investors. That's typically pension schemes. It's been mainly pension schemes in the past, but it's changing to be a wider remit of investors, but typically very large investors who are investing globally across all sorts of asset classes, and you're just advising them on things like their overall investment strategy, how much risk they should take, what managers they should appoint, which sort of strategies should they sort of employ. And that's distinct to the more traditional actuarial route, where you would become potentially a scheme actuary who's responsible for doing the actuarial valuations on a scheme, and is a more technical kind of actuarial thing, because you're calculating the liabilities of a scheme, really. So for these large pension schemes, you've got the assets and you've got the liabilities. As an investment consultant, you mainly deal with the assets. As a traditional actuary, you're mainly looking at the liabilities. But of course, there's a bit of overlap there, and so you do work with those. We both do work with each other, but that's typically the difference.
And as you mentioned about those differences, is there a person who's better suited to one than another, or there maybe a skill set that they all need?
Yeah, I would say the traditional actuarial route is probably more technical, so it's probably more suited to your sort of very technical actuaries. There is a decent amount of technicality on the investment side as well, but the investment piece is a bit broader when you're looking at sort of investment strategies and you're working with asset managers and you're doing manager selection and those sort of things. It strays away a little bit from the more sort of technical basis. But typically I think I feel very fortunate in terms of when I joined the industry, and certainly at that point the investment consulting piece was growing really fast at that point in time, around the early 2000s, and the traditional actuarial piece was at that point maybe growing a bit slower. That's still sort of true a little bit, but there's less difference, I would say, today between the sort of growth rates of the two bits.
What do you think are the key drivers of those differential growth rates today, and is it a bit slower today than?
Well, the industry just matured a little bit. So investment consulting wasn't really a thing until maybe the 90s, I would say, or late 90s. So, when I was joining the industry, it was relatively early on in investment consulting being really a distinct thing from actuarial services. And so that's why those businesses were growing fast, because there was really quite a big demand for what they were doing. And that sort of grew and grew. And obviously there's been a huge explosion of a variety of investment strategies and opportunities out there over the last sort of decade or more, and so that's just created more and more work for investment consultants to do. Whereas on the actuarial side, the work it's a more mature sort of industry. So the work has just been steadier on that front. Still very much there, still expanding, but it's just been a steadier kind of flow of it.
And kind of with those different, investment strategies that you mentioned, I'm sure kind of some of those are very kind of quantitative, right? So kind of, you did kind of leave the investment consultancy world and kind of go on to become a quant. Was that kind of a natural progression, or was that kind of, there was a bit of a career change there?
It was a little bit of a career change, yeah, and it wasn't all necessarily planned out. I mean, you sort of look back on your career, and I feel very grateful for the way things have worked out, but I didn't necessarily sort of plan it all. I mean, I was at Mercer for sort of 4 or 5 years, qualified as an actuary. And one thing you get as an investment consultant is a fantastic overview of the industry. I mean, I really would recommend people consider it, really for that reason, because you get to see all sorts of different asset managers, how they approach the world, all kinds of different investment strategies, everything from property to emerging markets to corporate debt to derivatives and hedging. So it's a fantastic sort of education, I think, in the industry. And so I did that for sort of 4 or 5 years. I actually decided that I wanted to move to Australia, sort of more for a sort of personal lifestyle decision at that point, and started to investigate what my options might be if I was to move there. And I think this is sort of 2007 time. So Australia was popular then as a place to go, but probably not as popular as it's become in the last decade. So if anything, I felt I had slightly more options moving to Australia because they felt they were maybe slightly more limited at the time in their sort of talent pool they were drawing on compared to London. So I was able to make that sort of a slight shift that I think would have been a bit harder for me to do at the time in London. Got in touch with Macquarie, who were a big part of the financial services market, obviously in Australia. And found a job working as a quant for a fund they were working on. Ended up working with the same team for the whole time I was in Australia. We ended up moving around a little bit to a few different firms. But that was super interesting as well to be on the other side of that.
So you mentioned 2007, and the first thing I think of 2007, I think 2008, and I think of the Great Recession. So how did that impact kind of living through it and working through it? What was that like?
Yeah, I mean, it's an experience, right? It's certainly pretty formative, and again, I was very lucky because I was working at a fund that was effectively, it was a long vol fund, right? So we're effectively doing long biased option positions, betting on volatility increasing at particular points in time. And so obviously that was actually a pretty good strategy to be employing through 2008 and a lot of certain times later as well. It was a good strategy. So I felt quite close to this sort of when you're in that sort of fund, you do feel like you're quite close to the sort of what's going on in financial markets generally. And of course, because we were in the sort of the Asian time zone, I mean, Lehman Brothers effectively went bust over the weekend. So it hit the Asian time zone first. So the sort of Sydney markets and were some of the first ones to open, and some of those really big weekends back in 2008. And so you really felt like you were at the forefront of what was going on. And it was pretty extreme what was happening at the time. And it was sort of pretty interesting to see how it all panned out. Really, yeah, very interesting.
And how do you think kind of living through that recession, kind of living through the pandemic we have going on today? I mean, does that give you kind of a unique perspective on it today, or?
Yeah, I've discussed this with a lot of my sort of contemporaries, and I feel that maybe people of sort of my I don't know, cohort, if you could call us that, who were a few years into their career when 2008 hit, that has probably influenced our risk aversion and our approach to risk generally, and maybe caused people to take not quite as much risk as they should have done in the decades since then. So I think that maybe caused a lot of investment strategies to be launched and get popular that were focusing on trying to reduce risk, just because people were so sort of scarred and a little bit scared by the 2008 experience. So then, of course, we had a decade where investment risk almost didn't exist really, and every single little dip lasted for sort of a couple of minutes. And had a lot of conversations with people over the last decade kind of saying, well, it'll be interesting to see how this one ends, sort of thing, because a lot of people have been saying for years that we would do more of a correction. And then, of course, I don't think anyone saw it sort of ending in a pandemic and a big crash, and then an equally fast recovery. So it's confused a lot of people, that's for sure.
And kind of in that sense, going back to your kind of being a quant, how does kind of you worked through a quant as kind of around 2008, a bit longer than that, and you moved back to the investment consultancy industry. But kind of as an outsider looking back into the quant industry, kind of where do you see it progressing in the future?
Yeah, I mean, it's always great to have. I mean, it's always great to have that, both that broad perspective and that kind of narrower kind of depth of knowledge. And I've been in both kind of roles in my career, and I think that's a judgment that everyone has to kind of weigh up at some point. I think whether you want to kind of go really deep in a really kind of narrow niche, or whether you want to stay in a kind of broader kind of role. And I think ultimately the broader kind of role probably suits me a little bit better. For other people will want to go the other way, but that's something that I'm glad that I managed to sort of try out both those ends while I was in my 20s, and sort of figure out which of those suited me better, because it sort of changes a bit over time as well. But sorry, so you were saying perspective on quant strategies now. I mean, yeah, it is interesting. I did work with some pretty good people, I would say, when I was on that sort of side of the fence, looking at quant strategies. And quant approaches they've been a big theme for a long time, I guess, right? They're not anything new. They've been gathering steam since the 90s, really, and certainly over the last 10-15 years have really gathered a lot of steam, and to the point where it would be tough to be launching a new quant strategy today, right? There's so many big, well-established names, your AQRs and your Bridgewaters and your CFMs and stuff like that. You would always struggle to make headway as a new sort of player. And it's even to the point where, quant strategies have mainly had a really tough couple of years, like really, really tough, especially this year has been pretty brutal in terms of the performance a lot of those strategies have had. So, it's a bit of a crossroads in many ways, I think, in that up until maybe a year ago, it had almost been a one-way street in terms of those strategies getting more popular, collecting more AUM, investors doing more and more of it. But now there are some question marks over some of the risk management, some of the performance, and whether investors want to sort of do that or not. So I think it is an interesting time for quant strategies, but it's not quite the plain sailing that maybe was taking place, over the last decade.
And kind of speaking about the quant strategy you talked about, kind of the one focused on, I think you said volatility, right? And kind of predicting that and making gains off of that. As markets get a bit more efficient, with more and more quant players, kind of, do you see the role of quants itself actually kind of almost diminishing in not necessarily in the near future, but kind of a bit longer term?
Do I see it diminishing? That's a good question. I wouldn't say I see it diminishing. I mean, there has to come a point where it sort of just stabilizes and becomes more of an sort of equilibrium. I mean, as I was saying, I guess a big theme has been quant strategies just getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and I guess that maybe is that sort of theme is played out a little bit and is coming to more of an end. But clearly the idea of using algorithms, using very sophisticated computing power and stuff, that has been around as an idea for a long time. And as computing power has grown and grown, these big funds have put more and more computer power to work. So that's clearly a big influence in the markets. And a lot of people are speculating as to whether it influences the way markets crash now, whether it influences the speed at which markets crash, the speed at which they recover. And I think it almost certainly does. So I think we're just at the start of understanding what it's done to markets, if you like, the sort of quant effect. And I suppose once people understand what that's done to markets, it creates opportunities for other people, whether those are other quants or not, to come in. So it's just an endless kind of arms race, isn't it? And things sort of improving and getting better.
And do you see a similar parallel arms race in investment consultancy, like kind of using new techniques or?
Investment consultancy, I wouldn't say it's so much about that, but investment consultancy, what the sort of big trend at the moment is moving a little bit further afield in terms of the investors that we're talking to. The sort of traditional market, certainly in the UK, was pension schemes. And if you go back 10 or 20 years, a lot of the biggest sort of institutional investors were pension schemes. Whereas now it's really changed. I mean, there's obviously sovereign wealth funds are a really big part of the landscape globally. Plenty of family offices and sort of endowments become quite powerful sort of investors as well. And then more and more private wealth managers that are investing on behalf of hundreds of thousands of underlying clients have also got quite big. So the way sort of wealth and assets have concentrated over the last 10 or 20 years has meant that consultants have now there's now a richer set of potential investors that might have a need for the sort of things that consultants can do.
And kind of you mentioned that they're consultants, right? So I mean, are there more consultants, or is it kind of, if you compare it to something like investment banking, right, where you're advising companies, but now you're kind of advising institutional clients and these types of clients? What's kind of the biggest differences do you see between these two kind of roles?
I think a big difference you see generally in the industry is people who are focused on transactions versus people who are focused on more of an ongoing kind of mindset, right? That to me is a big division in the finance industry generally. And so the investment banking type model is very transactionally focused. People who are advising companies are generally quite transactionally focused. So it's kind of a deal mentality, as in you identify the deal you're going to do, you put together a project plan, do an enormous amount of work to get the deal over the line, lots of negotiating over finer points and refining stuff. Then it's done, over onto the next thing. Whereas investment consulting is very different to that, because if you think of the mindset of a long-term investor, it's not really about doing deals like that. It's taking a really long-term view, and you might be making small changes to your strategy all the time, but you're not making big changes, or you probably shouldn't be making big changes. So it's just keeping that ongoing kind of view of your long-term objectives, keeping that in mind, doing research, but just kind of slowly evolving it and just having that ongoing mindset. And again, those two areas suit different sorts of people. I've got friends who work on the more transactional side and they love it, right? And some people want that kind of the high of having a deal and getting something over the line and high-fiving, whereas other people get a lot more out of the more longer term kind of relational side. So it's just what suits you, really.
Yeah, so that was actually going to be my next question, but so kind of a slightly different question. It's more kind of about students going into the industry today. Are there kind of key pieces of advice for students thinking about joining the industry, be that investment consultancy or as a quant or even just finance in general?
Yeah, I mean, as I say, when I look back, I feel very fortunate that I ended up in a role to begin with that was very broad and gave me a really great overview of of the industry and what was going on. And so, I suppose part of if I was chatting to people, I would say, don't worry too much about getting really specific early on. I would say, in your 20s, a really valuable thing you can do is get yourself in positions where you get to see a lot of what goes on, and you'll learn an awful lot of interesting stuff. And it's not until sort of way later that you need to get so worried about kind of really pinning down what you're going to do. And that's certainly one thing that I would say. And another one, I guess, is just making the most of those situations when you're in them. I mean, I try and impress upon the graduates that we have at LC&P today what a fortunate position they're in to be, because it is. I didn't realize it necessarily on day one when I was a grad. The fortunate position we were in being a consultant, that you really can get so much insight into what all these different asset managers do. So I think when you get yourself in one of those positions, just making the absolute most out of it, and trying to take on as much information as you can, understand different approaches to the world, rather than just sort of accepting whatever your firm does as the only way. So those are probably two of the main things that sort of stick out to me.
Taking your piece of advice about kind of looking at a more holistic view, I guess, of the finance world. I mean, do you always have a kind of a parallel piece of advice for that for students, kind of taking a more bigger view of kind of what's out there besides just finance, or maybe just in a consultancy or investment consultancy? Or is it kind of I know you said you got kind of you enjoyed your actuarial course, so you pursued it from following from that. But for students who don't kind of really know what they do want to do, what kind of advice do you have for them?
Yeah, it's a good point. I mean, and the world is different today. You know, when I was a student, you know, banking was very much the thing, and yeah, I suppose there is still presumably some level of sort of prestige and attraction to banking in many ways, and finance as well. But I think that's obviously changed a little bit over the years, and probably rightly so. I mean, there probably was a period of time when maybe too many people were sort of going that way. But you know, the idea of purpose at work and sort of meaning in what you do, yeah, that very much exists in finance and investing, especially on the investing side, right? Because you know, in many ways, you're helping your clients, and your clients always have underlying beneficiaries, be those the pensioners or the individuals who are saving, and so yeah, there really is a sense of purpose in helping them invest better, yeah, helping them reduce their costs, helping them manage their risks better, helping them understand things. So yeah, I think that there is a real sort of purpose-driven side to it. So I wouldn't worry. Some of those finance gets presented as being the sort of the anti kind of purpose and meaning. I don't think that's really fair at all. But yeah, I mean, I think trying to understand a little bit what's what in finance, and forming a view of what you might want to do is probably important, because yeah, I guess firms, it's competitive out there, isn't it? And firms, when they're interviewing, they're going to want to see that you've done a bit of reading, and started to understand stuff. But again, one big advantage today that I keep saying to people is just the amount of stuff that's available out there, either on podcasts or blogs, you know, just for free, is just staggering. I mean, I'm a big podcast listener myself, and the amount of podcasts you can listen to where you've got some of the biggest founders in the investment industry, some of the biggest researchers, some of the biggest investors, just talking on podcasts about what they do and their stuff. You can learn as much as a master's degree, I think, on podcasts and reading the right blogs. So there's a lot out there, but I suppose it's having the time and the focus and the discipline to actually sort of sit down and try and sort of make sense of some of it.
Can I ask you for kind of your favorite podcast recommendations?
Yeah, so on the investment side, there's just so many. I mean, one I really like is called Animal Spirits, which is two guys in the US who work for a wealth management firm. They talk a lot about the markets. That's a really good listen. If you want to hear from some of the best kind of investors, then Masters in Business by Bloomberg. It's hosted by a chap called Barry Ritholtz. That's really good. And there's a podcast called Capital Allocators by Ted Seides. And he talks to a lot of the biggest kind of investors out there as well. And then the other one maybe to mention is the Morningstar one. They tend to have a pretty good selection of researchers and investors and those sort of things. So that's just a few, but I probably have 10 or 20 that I kind of follow, and then I don't get a chance to listen to them all, obviously, but I can.
If I'm not mistaken, you actually work on one yourself, right? Is it investment?
We do. Thanks for bringing that up. Very kind of you. Yeah, I wasn't going to go quite as far as plugging that, but seeing you mention it, yeah, we launched a podcast at the start of the year called Investment Uncut. So do check that out. It's on Apple, Spotify, Pocket Cast, and all the good platforms. And me and one of my colleagues, we interview people from our firm and from other firms with particular insights. So, one day we might be talking about property investment, another day might be talking about emerging markets, might be talking about inflation. We've started interviewing some of our clients and some sort of investors in terms of how they see the world and those sort of things. So we try and keep it short, and I think we're building up our audience, and it seems to be going okay.
There's so much information out there, but how do you kind of sift through it? How do you decide what's important, what's not important?
Yeah, well, what a good question. I mean, that has to be one of the most important skills in today's world, right? And I think it probably is a bit underrated. I mean, there's so many sort of apps and things that we're interfacing with these days. I mean, even at work, there's a sort of an internal social network almost called Yammer. Then you've obviously got Microsoft Teams, you've got emails. That's just internally. Then obviously you've got Twitter and LinkedIn that I happen to use quite a lot and follow. I think everyone has their own sort of approach to that. I mean, I maybe spend a little bit longer than I should do on social media and that sort of stuff. But I think it gets you into good habits, of digesting stuff quickly, replying to stuff quickly, and sort of moving on. which I think is important. I mean, the things that have worked for me, just getting your processes right around making sure you stay focused on what is really important, because clearly, getting back to clients who are asking you important questions is far more important than some kind of intellectual debate you're having with a colleague or something on another channel, right? So being able to really stay focused on what matters and have some kind of system where you just know exactly what things you have to get done each day to just kind of keep you sort of anchored. And then I still think that the corporate world generally is going through a process where we're figuring out how to use some of these tools better. I think Microsoft Teams has generally been a really good thing, but I see a lot of people using it in sort of suboptimal ways, and a lot of people who can't resist kind of reverting back to email and stuff, and that just makes the whole thing worse because it just makes you have more channels. So we're still in a period of transition, I think, and we will be for years, I think, while people are learning some of those new habits for how to use things. But I think if you can discipline yourself and your team to operate in a certain way, there's a lot of value to that. And I do think it's a bit underrated actually in the workplace, that the skill of doing that. You see some people who do it really well and others who struggle and are kind of constantly sort of drowning a little bit in stuff because they haven't managed to figure that one out.
And just kind of as a final question, like, is there any kind of final piece of advice, kind of any final thing you'd like to say to the membership and kind of people who are reviewing?
I would say make them go broad with your sort of with your research and with your aspirations. I think there's really something to be said for trying to get a really good flavor of what different things happen across the whole industry. And the way I look back, I spent most of my 20s kind of getting a huge variety of experiences, and I'm incredibly grateful that I was able to do that. And that's the sort of thing that I would recommend other people try and do. And then just that other point around there being so many resources out there right now, just try and find a way to tap into some of those and get access to some of the thinking that sort of people have, because it's a huge world out there, the world of investments. There's all sorts of things going on. There's all sorts of roles, and it could take you years to figure out what's really right for you and sort of get yourself in that place. So a lot of people spend a lot of time trying to plot a really specific career path. That's not the way I did it, and I wouldn't necessarily recommend people try and do that because it's just too hard. But just exposing yourself to a lot of stuff, and then making the most opportunities when they come up would be my best advice, I guess. It's the best I've got. I'm not sure it's great, but it's all I got.
No, that was great advice. Dan, thanks very much for joining us. I'm sure kind of everyone really enjoyed that.
It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me on.